Great. So to kick us off, we'll start by telling you all a little bit about us as a journal, who we are, and kind of what we're working on. So Miran, if you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Great. So we are an academic journal that aims to publish peer-reviewed articles about Tamil people and Tamil communities across the world, and we like to look at all the different disciplines, and even more happy to publish papers that are interdisciplinary. We recognize that academia has a deep colonial history that can still that we still see today, and is quite exclusionary. So as a journal, we hope to question this model, think of new ways that we can operate and create the space for Tamil voices that have been systematically silenced. So next slide, please. So எங்களுடைய தொகுப்பின் நோக்கம் உலகெங்கும் உள்ள தமிழ் மக்கள் மற்றும் சமூகங்களை பற்றிய அனைத்து துறைகளில் இருந்தும் கட்டுரைகள் வெளியிடுவது. உலகெங்கும் கல்வி துறைகளும் பதிப்புகளும் இதழ்களிலும் கொலோனியல் வரலாற்றால் பல்வேறு சமூகங்களின் கதைகள் மற்றும் குரல்கள் நம்மளால் கேட்பது முடிவதில்லை. ஸோ எங்களுடைய தொகுப்பின் மூலம் இதை மாற்ற மற்றும் ஒடுக்கப்பட்ட தமிழ் மக்களின் குரல்களை முன்னிலைப்படுத்துவதே எங்களுடைய நோக்கம். So for the first day of the conference, we've had in the past our first publication, which was a thematic issue titled Tamil Resistance in the 21st Century, that was aligned with the 10 years of the Mullivaikkal Remembrance Day. We had a shock call that was thematic around climate change and Tamils. And finally, we have our 2023 non-thematic call for papers. And people who have submitted their work for this call, the authors and the speakers that you'll be hearing more about their research today and kind of their approach. We have published some of the authors, and you can find these papers on our website. So please feel free to go read them after today. So thank you. வெளியிட்டிருக்கிறோம். இந்த கட்டுரைகள் உங்களுக்கு படிக்க விருப்பம் இருந்தால் எங்கள் இணையதளத்தில் நீங்கள் பார்க்கலாம். So hope you enjoy today, and we look forward to hearing everyone's questions at the end. So now I'll pass it on to Harikesan to introduce the first author for today.
Thank you, Srinidhi. So I'm Harikesan. So like Srinidhi, we're both editors here at the Tamil Academic Journal. So let's start with Nibarna. So Nibarna is an integrative physiotherapist and clinical lead who works from an integrative approach, weaving together transcultural, person-centered, early attachment, existential, and narrative lenses. Her paper today will be on Mind the Acculturation Gap, Migration, Acculturation Gaps, and Mental Health within the Tamil Diaspora. Nibarna will present her review of existing literature related to acculturation gaps within Tamil families that migrated from Sri Lanka, finding a critical need for research at the intersection of Tamil diaspora and acculturation gaps research. Nibarna, it's all yours.
Amazing, thank you. I will share screen. So I'm aware this is a lot of things and it was quite ambitious, so bear with me, and if you've got any questions, absolutely at the end we can go through them. So I will be speaking a little bit about migration gaps and acculturation gaps, but also towards the latter end, which will be about the 10-minute mark, I will also be presenting Amber UK's needs assessment, which is based on childhood sexual abuse. So if you need to step out, it will be about 3 minutes, or if you need any self-care measures in place, please do feel free to look after yourself. And I don't know, Srinidhi, if you wanted to translate.
Yes. So எல்லோருக்கும் ஒரு தூண்டுதல் எச்சரிக்கை. குழந்தை பருவ பாலியல் வன்முறை பற்றி நிபர்ணா கடைசியில் பேச போகிறார். இந்த தலைப்பு கேட்பது கடினமாக இருந்தால் தயங்காமல் அழைப்பை விட்டுவிட்டு அடுத்த ஸ்பீக்கர் 10 நிமிடங்களில் மீண்டும் பேசுவார். ஸோ அப்பொழுது நீங்கள் இந்த காலை சேரலாம். And one of us will let you in. So feel free to take the space you need.
Thank you. So to introduce the space, I guess I thought a quote would be a lovely way to sort of begin. And I think I quite like this one, that there is no greater sorrow on earth than the loss of one's native land, which I think aptly describes people that need to leave their country of origin in an involuntary manner. So I think this is particularly true of the collective trauma experienced by the Tamil community prior to migration, because it plays a really important role when it comes to mental health post-migration, and as people are migrating due to often having to leave family members behind, identities and skilled jobs and their homes. So we're looking a little bit further into that. And current research, not particularly in the Tamil community, but general migrating community, shows that pre-migratory, migratory, and post-migratory challenges all play in a mental health presentation. So if we were going to look at Eurocentric diagnoses, they would be presenting as anxiety, depression, and PTSD, to name a few. So it's really important that we think about multifaceted approaches when we're thinking about supporting mental health, as they usually end up having an intergenerational impact if they're not spoken about or looked into. So the framework that I've used at the moment is Berry's model of acculturation. It's quite dated from the 1990s, but it's still quite relevant when we want to contextualize some of our work. And so to define acculturation, it is the shift in values, behaviors, and belief systems when one individual moves from one country and its values to another country. And they propose 4 ways. He suggests that we do this in 4 ways. 1, we assimilate. So we adopt the new host country culture whilst completely rejecting where the native culture is from. The other is separation. So you do the opposite. You reject the host culture whilst you retain native only. And then 3, which is our ideal, which rarely happens, is simultaneously adopting both the host culture and the native culture. And lastly, they suggest that some folks might go into marginalization. They reject both and find quite a difficult experience of trying to bring in 2 cultures. More importantly, when we're thinking about families and systemically, I think Shaposnik and Kurtner further built on that to think about acculturation gaps. So what happens when we bring in a whole family into the mix as opposed to just one person? And they suggest that children of immigrants acculturate much, much faster than their parents, which leads to family conflicts due to the difference in the said values, behaviors, and belief systems. From my experience, usually you notice a first generation that have migrated might do a little bit of separation, so rejections of the host culture because it's new and there's so much processing that's needed to happen, whilst trying to hold on to native culture. And then you might see in the second and third generation more assimilation, integration, and marginalization, which can cause some intergenerational difficulties. And when we think about what the current Lit Review looks like, there isn't any in the Tamil diaspora just yet. And so this was widened out to all migrating groups, and acculturation gap was used. And within the past 5 years, so last year to 2017, and it confirms that acculturation gap and distress is one of the biggest factors in families when families migrate, that they're both family members don't feel so great about how to talk about culture or how to retain both cultures. A number of papers also really called for culturally informed ways of working, which I'm sure isn't news to any of us in the sort of when we're working Eurocentrically, that it isn't decolonized, it is using diagnoses from DSM-5, which usually is based on white populations. So there's a strong call for that. A few less people called for systemic ways of working, so thinking more about family and collective systems of working as opposed to the traditional individualistic one-to-one therapy models. And even though I think it's really important, there was even less papers sort of thinking about parent well-being. So how are parents doing? How can we support them as a preventative measure in order to make sure the following generations can do a little bit better? So the literature suggests that actually we need to be looking into this, and family conflicts can be caused in migrating families due to acculturation gaps. And I think although there's a lot of research and maybe not so much in the Tamil diaspora, I think we are in a place, which I'll talk to a little bit later, to move on to how can we do it. We all have lived experiences, and so how can we build on that rather than, I guess, reiterate what perhaps we already know, and doesn't have to be peer published per se. And to bring it back into sort of Tamil context, so bear with me, we are going to take a little bit of a journey. So we go pre-migration. If we look at the factors, I won't read all of this out, but I think it's important to think about ancestral history as well, more current history. I think there's waves of disruptions and development and attachment that happens much further across centuries, let alone decades. And so I think these are all factors that practitioners should bear in mind when they're thinking about how do we work with ancestral trauma, war trauma, as well as migratory trauma. These are all Tamil literatures now where we do have a stronghold, I guess, is thinking about migration. And so some authors really highlight the challenges in refugee camps, such as barriers to basic human rights, food, water, shelter, sanitation, and access to safety, existential issues, so more therapeutic, of having to hold multiple identities as a migrant, as a parent, as somebody that's the breadwinner. And that's all in the face of uncertainty and new laws and policies and country cultures. And also themes of bereavement, loss, and grief, of having to just get on with it when actually there's so much bereavement work that could possibly be done as well. And I think some papers, and I think it's also really important to think about multiple marginalized identities when migration happens, that the access and barriers are much higher for people that hold multiple marginalized identities, which include sexuality, religion, caste, and to name just a few. And so they need to be really thought about when we think about who has access to what, even within the same community. So in terms of papers that we have all as a collective managed to do, it is quite global. So we've got papers from Australia, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, the UK, and the USA. Majority of our papers at the moment, again, a 5-year span, so there's probably loads more out there, is the main themes is a transnational activism in the diaspora. So this is quite well recorded and a strong sense that does unite the globe. Generations are working for reparative measures and recognition of the civil war. Then where I focus on in a little bit is trauma and mental health. So there's a lot of papers alluding to the stigma globally and the lack of culturally informed and community-centered approaches. This includes language barriers and lack of knowledge around Tamil history and context. We then also have quite a few papers around identity, which was quite interesting. And some of these themes were victimhood, intergenerational trauma, as well as intergenerational wisdom and caste system perpetuation, as well as gender role. And the last two, a little less papers, but still important as they came up as a theme, were language maintenance, which I think Minofa might be speaking to a little bit later on, but also Tamil women's experiences. There's been some research done in what happens to women post-migration. And so in terms of recommendations and bridging the gap, I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, and I think I've sped through this a little bit faster, so please do ask questions, is that we are in a place to explore interventions, therapeutic approaches, because we can build on what we already have at the moment. And I think keeping the 5 factors in mind of when working with families, how do we incorporate acculturation gaps and hold both the parent who has very valid and good reasons to wanting to keep parts alive, and children and grandchildren who might not see the same way, and how do we increase the dialogue there? Being a bit more culturally informed, whether that is representation ourselves in these fields, or whether that is training and showing other people, actually, this is the history that we're working with. And moving more into systemic ways of working, so family systems as opposed to individuals. Both can work really well, but I think it works even better when we can have systemic practitioners. And maybe thinking more preventative, thinking about parent well-being. How do we support parents, their bereavement, their loss, in order to dialogue a little bit better? And lastly, but definitely not least, is trauma-informed ways of working. How do we do a lot of stabilization work so these conversations can happen, rather than bringing in more re-traumatization? And this particular literature review is forming as part of a bigger project that does look into sort of how to increase dialogue using the Tree of Life. So I am currently doing that, and current findings are really interesting, because I think what I'm hearing from families is they'd really like to talk to each other. They've witnessed their parents' struggles, and parents have witnessed their kids and how protective they've been, or their cultural clashes when they were teenagers. But I think what the space they're currently sort of saying is that we never got to talk about it. We just witnessed it, and it's a really lovely way to hear each other talk and see how they formulate or make meaning out of it. So if you're interested, you're welcome to get in touch as well. And so I'm going to now switch hats a little bit into Amber UK's needs assessment. So if you do need to step aside, we've gone green with Amber's theme. If you need to step aside or have a grounding object, please do. We won't be going into any details of CSA, but Taja kindly publishing this as a full report. So this is just a couple of slides as an overview of what we found. And to situate ANBU, which Shavina is also a part of, who you'll hear from in a little bit, is ANBU stands for Abuse Never Becomes Us. It's a UK-based charity for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the Tamil community. And it offers therapeutic groups once a year for groups of adult survivors, as well as intergenerational psychoeducative workshops, which includes Tamil schools for parents thinking about safeguarding and supporting disclosures, as well as Tamil societies thinking about healthy relationships and consent, to name just a very, very tiny few. And we also offer independent sexual violence advocacy for anyone that would like to report, and community events to raise awareness as well. So the community needs assessment that we did was actually in 2019. We had a really good response rate of 123 from the Tamil community, and we explored 5 themes: so demographic details, migration journeys, knowledge about CSA, talking about CSA, disclosures and healing and transitions, and well-being for survivors. The responses, you did 20% who were female survivor responding, 2%, which is still very, very small for male survivors, 41 and 20 female, and 25 and non-male survivor. Oh gosh, 25% male non-survivors. There you go. I think one of the key findings was that 88% of survivors were more likely to know another survivor, whilst 56% of non-survivors were likely to know a survivor, which is quite a high rate considering this is 123 people sample. So in terms of key findings, the practitioner messages that we found were members from the UK Tamil community are experiencing CSA, but knowledge about this in the wider UK CSA literature is lacking. We have a lot around South Asian communities, but not enough that is specific to the Tamil community. Over half of the respondents who identified as survivors of CSA hadn't engaged in any therapeutic support, which indicates a significant gap in existing service provisions. And similarly to before, there was a real call for collectivist and community-orientated approaches as form of support, as opposed to just one-to-one. And this was felt important by non-survivors as well as survivors of CSA that responded. And lastly, a recommendation was an intersectional approach to examine the experiences of UK Tamil CSA survivors, which took into context migration, war, and intergenerational trauma, of why perhaps disclosures might be a little bit more difficult, as well as different intersecting identities. There is a much more fuller 20-page report at least, so please feel free to read through that. And if you have any questions, again, happy to answer at the end. But if you have any thoughts or ideas on top of that, you can also email Ambu at ask@ambu.org.uk. That is it for me. I think I've whizzed it a little bit too fast, but I can take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think it was really interesting to hear about your research, and I think often it's very rare to have that space in Tamil families to like talk to each other and to like center that as a huge part of the healing journey is really interesting. And thank you also for presenting Anbu's report, and I think it's very, very necessary work that's being done. So yeah. If everyone's happy, we will move on to our next speaker. We have Aparna. So Aparna is a student, researcher, facilitator, and activist whose community-based research examines the intersections of gendered violence, displacement. She's currently a PhD student in the social justice education program in Ontario's Institute for Studies in Education, housed in the University of Toronto. She's an experienced public speaker, educator, and published researcher who's dedicated to building spaces for political education, community care. Her writing can be found in the Comparative International Education Journal and the Journal for Studies in Education of Adults. So thank you, Aparna, and I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you so much, Srinidhi. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Do we see that? Amazing. I'm also going to start with a tiny apology. I am currently on the island and it is 8:55 p.m. here. And the place I'm staying at, there are a bunch of young families that are screaming and running around, which is great, but also you might hear some background noise. Thank you so much for inviting me to offer a presentation to the Tamil Academic Journal Conference. It's honestly been such a journey with this paper and navigating the writing of it and the peer review process through Tamil Academic Journal. And I've been so grateful to people like Ambige and the entire team at Tamil Academic Journal who have been so supportive of this work. Especially because it's deeply connected to so many of my fellow presenters that are offering important interventions into studies around Tamilness, more globally speaking. The title of my presentation and the title by virtue of the paper is, in quotations, "This is too political for the classroom. What does protest mean and the regulation and suppression of genocide education in Ontario classrooms?" So the first statement here is actually something that I've heard regularly repeated, both by administrative staff, principals, teachers, and other folks that are involved in school spaces around the Ontario region. And so when I mention Ontario here, I'm speaking about a specific province within what is so-called Canada, where I am located and where I have been facilitating these workshops for around 5 years now. The two main concepts I'm going to be exploring in my presentation, it's actually very much connected to what you were mentioning in yours, Nibarna, about dialogue. This is extremely significant in the way that we understand how students are able to engage in dialogue meaningfully in spaces that are quite literally physically constructed for them to engage in dialogue. But when we look at the case study of genocide education, particularly Tamil genocide education, students are surveilled, monitored, and policed by administrative staff for their student activism in so-called Canada. And I'm going to act. Most of the data that is collected through observations that I made as a Tamil genocide educator in classrooms across the Greater Toronto area from 2019 to 2023. Also, Srinidhi, if you don't mind, could you let me know if I'm cutting in and out? Just because it says my internet connection's a bit unstable, so I can switch it around.
Yeah, I think you were initially. Now it seems to have stabilized, but if we can't hear you at any point, we let you know.
Great. Thank you so much. So the data is collected through observations I made as a Tamil genocide educator. And here I'm particularly looking at the case study of Tamil genocide education throughout the month of May, where Tamils across the world mark May 18th. And Tamil identifying students and allies organize teach-ins, facilitator presentations, and workshops around this topic. My presentation is going to move a little bit more into the diversity of topics that are covered within each presentation. But for the purpose of introducing the study, I'm just going to overall call it Tamil genocide education. So the Ontario province mandated that this work happen in May 2021, when the government passed Bill 104, or the Tamil Genocide Education Week Act, and proclaimed a 7-day period
Aparna, you're cutting out for us again. Okay, let's just give Aparna a couple of more minutes.
For Ontarians aside. In valid, 1 second.
Aparna, sorry, we seem to
Totally.
be cutting out. Would it be helpful if one of us shares your presentation so that helps your internet connection be a bit more stable?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi.
Hi. Maybe someone from our team will share your presentation so that it's not putting too much of a strain on your bandwidth. And
It's so okay. I switched internet. I should be clear now, but if it happens a second time, maybe we could switch to the team member presenting. How does that sound?
that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I try to be as engaging as possible, and maybe my internet cutting out is part of the tricks. So students, from my observations in classrooms, continue to express difficulty bringing this work into their classrooms, as they are met with teachers that dismiss their efforts with accusations of quote unquote terrorism, which is far too recognizable for many Tamil identifying students in schools across the world, to be very honest, or the assertion that classrooms are not meant for politically charged conversations, hence the title of this presentation. This is too political for a classroom. I'm really interrogating that question. What is political for a classroom? As you can see, as I move later on my presentation, a lot of my reflections are framed by a thinker named Paulo Freire, who argues that the very essence of a classroom is political in and of itself. So back in, let me just pull up the date of this presentation. Back in July of 2021, after offering a presentation to a classroom in Mississauga, which is a suburb right near the Toronto main city, a Tamil Canadian learner shared the following reflection with the class. This was after the presentation, and they were sharing their reflections on what they thought the presentation was like. They shared, "I now realize that there are gaping holes in the fabric of my family's history. Maybe I can try to understand their silences by connecting with the lesson in front of me in a deeper way." So this student's articulation of their familial history as a fabric with gaping holes struck a chord with me, because it accurately conveyed the necessity of revisiting genocide education with perspectives rooted in the lived experiences of students in the classroom. It was the first time that the student was connecting their own family experiences and memories with the material that was being taught to them. Meaning making and connection building has largely been missing in articulations of genocide education in the Ontario curriculum. A lack of opportunities to form connections in this area effectively isolates students from asking deeper and more thoughtful questions surrounding the socio-political conditions of war crimes and genocide, and its impact on their own histories, families, and communities. So I'm hoping that this paper will introduce dialogue as a Freirean point of entry into transformative genocide education. That had a whole bunch of words that I'll definitely explore more deeply when I move into the Freirean theoretical aspect of the presentation. But I wanted to reassert that I'll be using my own reflections from my time facilitating and presenting, as well as organizing virtual reading groups. In essence, we're trying to understand how educators can equip students to understand the quote unquote gaping holes and silences around them. But to understand where these gaping holes and silences even emerge from a curriculum aspect, we have to understand certain education acts, policies, and tools that are set up to sort of build the classroom space in Ontario. A significant bill is called the Ontario Safe Schools Act, which was implemented in the year 2000 to bring a definitive set of regulations and punishments that must be issued to students. I'm not being harsh when I use the term punishments. It's actually written into the bill that these are a definitive set of punishments and regulations. It's often referred to as a zero tolerance policy. Anyone who is from so-called Canada might be aware of a zero tolerance policy, or even folks from the UK. This is very similar to Prevent policy, which monitors, surveils, and silences many students in the UK as well. This policy essentially endows administrators and school officials with wide-ranging powers to suspend on a diverse range of behaviors. So our Human Rights Commission actually commissioned a report that looked at the implications of this act. And in quotations, they shared that there's a strong perception supported by some empirical evidence that the act and school board policies are having a disproportionate impact on racial minority students, particularly Black students and students with disabilities. So advocates for this policy may argue that this policy is quote unquote colorblind. But as many of us as scholars and many of us with lived experience as community members, no act, no policy exists being colorblind. Everything is ultimately influenced and shaped by power. This theoretical relationship to this perception of colorblindness, or let me say, this idea that we will all be treated as one within a system, negates so much of this specificity of racialized student experiences and ends up having a disproportionate impact on racialized students and students with disabilities. The next bill was a bill that was conveniently introduced in 2009. We love hearing the Tamil in the background. This was a bill that was introduced in 2009, and it was introduced by the McGuinty government to share and to essentially keep our kids safe at school. If passed, the bill would be the first of its legislation in Canada and would address, quote unquote, address reporting gaps between principals, teachers, and parents about serious students incidents that could lead to suspension or expulsion. The emergence of this act around 2009 is extremely important too, because it showcases just how much Tamil activism, Tamil student-led activism was picking up in Canada, and how policing surveillance around this time was also picking up in response to that. I'm not trying to say that Tamil activism existed in a microcosm or that Tamil students were the only ones protesting around this time, but with the emergence of many student-led movements, especially around university campuses, school buildings, and even in the downtown core itself, we see policies that emerge that try to repress the voices of students themselves and try to make the implementation of things such as genocide education that much more difficult. So this is the context in which Tamil genocide emerges. And in that, I'm sort of entering Frere as a dialogue point, as an entry point, for a very specific reason. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator and philosopher who advocated for a critical pedagogy rooted in love, humility, faith, trust, hope, and critical thinking. The quote from above, as vulgar as it may seem, is from a 1976 interview, which was titled Guns and Pencils, in which he shared a conversation with a resistance fighter in Guinea-Bissau. Frere recalled physically recoiling at the resistance fighter's description of a sexually violent war crimes committed by Portuguese soldiers, and he balled up his fists to ask whether they castrated the soldiers upon capture. The resistance fighter looked at Frere with confusion and replied, in quotations, "We have to respect the enemies, even if they don't respect us. Do you think we could respect them as human beings if we castrate them?" In the interview, Frere recognizes that while the guns or the politics of the petit bourgeois scholar, and petit bourgeois is essentially upper middle class or privileged scholar, is in their writing, the politics of the resistance fighter is quite literally their gun. These are the lived realities and forming futures of oppressed peoples, and it is only their actions that determine their subjectivity and what type of world they hope to build through revolution. The resistance fighters' reply to Frere exposed a central premise of education rooted in resistance. How do the oppressor and oppressed understand and act upon an ongoing process of subjectification? Frere understood that the spread of dominant hegemonic knowledge was only possible through the suppression of knowledge considered illegitimate. This is the continuous process where both the oppressor and the oppressed lose their humanity. So in essence, I'm using large words like subjectification, I'm talking about dominant hegemonic knowledge, but Frere really wants to understand how to center the human in our research, and not necessarily in a way where it centers singular narratives, but it's this idea of dialogue in which we are able to have meaningful, hard conversations on what democracy, civic courage, and humility, love, and faith can look like. And it is in Pedagogy of Freedom where he asserts that it is in listening to the student that I learn to speak with him or her. From the very act of listening and working with the student teacher, which is how he labels students themselves, because they aren't just students, they're also sharing knowledge and teaching knowledge to us. The classroom can be transformed into a space where subjectivity is uncovered, where the human subject can be uncovered and acted upon through dialogue. So it is in this presentation that I explore how Freire's conceptualization of dialogue in the classroom might be used as a point of entry into transformative learning in Tamil genocide education. Understood from this perspective, the oppressed recognizing and reclaiming their subjectivity through resistance is significant, not only for the humanization of themselves, but for their oppressors as well. Scholars, students, and activists struggle with this particular tenet of Freire's theory, as I do as well, because that anger, that righteous anger that is significant and important within the work that we do is always going to be there. But it is also within these tensions that I observe a space for dialogue to emerge, whereby authentic dialogue and subject formation are centered, particularly with and through the oppressed, whose subjectivity continues to be denied. So it's here where we can select and understand what the human means through a lot of Freirean dialogue and perspective. That was a lot of theory. I wanted to sort of give a little bit of a story to explain what I mean when I talk about subjectification, especially in the conversations of Tamil genocide education. So I recently presented a workshop to a secondary school in the GTA area, and a student and her friend shared memories of how they used to be ridiculed by their middle school teachers for commemorating the Tamil genocide. One student shared that her grade 7 teacher used to mock Tamil people on May 18th, which is Mulivaika Remembrance Day, which created an unsafe space for her to feel comfortable to speak up. Her reflection hit my body like a ton of bricks, mostly because I didn't realize the severity of traumatic interactions students navigate. I was shocked that some teachers were continuing to treat Tamil students like this, and reminded of the countless times that I've personally been shamed or mocked by teachers for wanting to talk about the struggle. In addition to this, one school was barred from attending these workshops because school administrators perceived it to be, quote unquote, too political for high school students, connecting it back to the question that was asked in the beginning of the presentation. I've heard this, quote unquote, feedback many times. How does it uniquely position Tamil genocide education as an othered topic, one that is not worthy or deserving to take up space in the classroom? And who am I speaking to in these workshops? And do I even have the words to articulate a more direct form of resistance? It is in this where student reflections play an important and key role in transforming the way that we look at Tamil genocide education. Because I'm not a singular educator in this space. In Canada, around the world, there are many, many folks that are trying to understand what genocide education can look like, especially in the present moment. And understanding it from the perspective of those who are receiving this information, who are working through this information with us, is extremely important. What I have up here is a Mentimeter. I'm not sure if folks remember that phase of COVID when everyone was using a Mentimeter on Zoom, but I was one of them. And the question that I had posed to students in a virtual workshop was, what do you think of when you see the term Tamil genocide education? And these were some of the words that were shared by folks. There was injustice, a pressing issue, educating, devastating, refugee. The one that stuck out the most to me was homes broken into pieces. And here, in expanding and speaking to students who shared those responses, we begin to understand that it isn't simply the physical destruction of a home in a homeland that they perhaps have never been to, but also the psychological and the socio-political destruction of their own homes through the fragmentation of memories that are shared or not shared with them. Here, there's such a significant space for Freire to emerge. Paulo Freire defines dialogue as an encounter between human beings who attempt to name the world as they are mediated by it. I'm going to repeat that. Human beings who attempt to name the world as they are mediated by it. Dialogue does not emerge from theorists who are outside of communities that are writing in these ivory towers or these posh rooms about folks that they might have had a chance to speak to maybe once or twice. Dialogue, authentic dialogue, emerges from people who are actively experiencing what they are theorizing, what they are constructing dialogue around. And it is in this case that I wonder, how can educators expect the oppressed to envision themselves as subjects in dialogue when their subjectivity is not acknowledged in curriculum? As I mentioned earlier, there are significant challenges posed to students that attempt to think through Tamil genocide education. Students to this very day are barred from having these workshops in their classroom. I myself, as a facilitator, have faced many barriers to bringing these workshops into classrooms. And we need to really understand how to build together in addressing these barriers, but not give up on the fact that no one of us holds the entire narrative or the entire story of Tamil genocide education. And that's why I titled my last 3 slides, Building Together. So I was recently invited to deliver a guest presentation to an assembly at an elementary school in Scarborough. If folks are from Scarborough in the chat, big up Scarborough, a large Tamil population and a very vibrantly political Tamil population. This was my first in-person presentation to such a wide range of learners from kindergarten to grade 8. And I was very nervous to even mention the Tamil genocide. I felt I didn't have enough skills to hold a conversation with young learners, and I didn't understand how to approach topics like genocide and violence. During the assembly, I spoke to protests, to 2009, to political demonstrations, and this relationship to state and land. As I neared the end of my presentation, I asked the students if they had any questions, and several hands shot up. I wanted to choose questions from students of all grades, so I picked a young student, a young-looking student, that might have been in grade 2. He lowered his hand and asked me, "What does protest mean?" His inquiry posed yet another breaking point in my journey to incorporate Freirean dialogue. So here we see how Freire argues that, quote unquote, many political and educational plans have failed because their authors designed them according to their own personal views of reality and never once took into account, except as mere objects of their action, the men in a situation to whom their program was directed. And so it is in this case, and it is in this line of thinking that Jensen as well writes, calls on critical pedagogues to abandon narratives in favor of creating space for the learner or the bearer of knowledge to examine their differences. That quote is a bit long, but essentially speaks about resisting master narratives, resisting this idea that an official curriculum can engage thoroughly with the needs of a student, and the understanding of a student of how they interact with the material in a classroom. It's also important to recognize that the student teacher, using Freirean language here, brings significant knowledge into a classroom when they enter that space. So here we're resisting Freire's banking system of education, this system of education where teachers look to deposit knowledge like they would in a bank into a student's supposedly empty mind. Freire argues that this banking system of education transforms the oppressed into inanimate objects that are controlled by a sadistic love on behalf of the oppressor to deposit, possess, and dominate. So here we're thinking about how educators must create a space in the curriculum for students to work through crisis by giving testimonies of their lived experience in relationship to the narratives that are taught in the classroom. Teaching and learning can only take place through entering and working through crisis, since it is in this process that moves a learner to interact with the representation of a topic like genocide. And it's here where there's a valid sense of urgency that emerges from Tamil teachers and Tamil allied teachers as well when speaking to the Tamil genocide. This urgency of the conflict that is so present in our minds, that is so everyday, that is so significantly charged, politically charged. Our choice to engage, though, in this banking system of education, or to choose to continue to reproduce oppressive systems of education when we talk about Tamil genocide, is actually further harming our students. So it's important that we work together to reject this idea of a neutral education and to motivate students and teachers to see their classroom as one moment of many to live and express as authentically and politically as possible. So it's in this line that I rethink my own lesson plans on the Tamil genocide, even the spaces in which I conduct Tamil genocide education, to grapple with these intersections in the history of the Tamil struggle involving class, identity, gender, caste, and so many other relations that create hierarchical structures. Moving towards community-centered programming, moving towards programming that is a bit more grassroots, that is a bit more connected to more what's happening on the ground, is extremely significant in this process of building together. And that brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. And I actually wanted to leave you all with a question. What does protest mean to you? There's an answer that I gave to the student, but I would love to hear folks' your own answer near the end when we have the Q&A period. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Yes, so what does protest mean to you? So do let us know, drop it in the chat or message us directly. So anyone with a tag written next to our names, feel free to send us your answers directly. Okay, so we're going to now move on to our next speakers. So Dr. Arasu Chelliah would have joined us today, but unfortunately, due to sudden changes in personal circumstances, he won't be joining us today. But we thought we still give a brief introduction to him and his work. So Dr. Chelliah is an adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. For the past several years, he has worked in voluntary organizations such as Tamil Sangams, Tamil Schools, and Federation of Tamil Sangam for North America. In addition to Tamil organization and Tamil education, Professor Arasu Chelliah has a keen interest in addressing climate change. He has published a book in Tamil, Let's Prepare to Face the Tamil Crisis, and he has given several talks online and in person on addressing the climate crisis. So today his talk would have been on the 6th greatest extinction, man-made causes and actions. His paper discusses the 6th impending mass extinction of species of living organisms, including implications for Tamil homelands and how this catastrophe can be prevented by humanity. We hope that in future events we can accommodate for this presentation, and we really look forward to seeing this presentation in future. Okay, so now we will move on to our next presenter, Shavina. Shavina is a PhD researcher within the Race Exchange Research Cluster across Coventry University and the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Her research focuses on alternative spaces of history and heritage education, diaspora communities create for themselves, and the types of knowledge centered in these spaces. The title of her work is Rethinking Resilience, exploring decolonial possibilities of representing narratives of conflict-affected women in the north and east of Sri Lanka. Shavina reflects on the interventions she formulated to overcome the reductive ways in which conflict-affected women in the north and east of Sri Lanka and their perspectives are traditionally represented. Shavina, the stage is all yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Cool. Hope everyone can see that. Yeah, brilliant. Cool. Thanks, Harry Kirsten, for that introduction. And thanks to the Tamil Academic Journal team, as kind of Aparna mentioned as well, just about all the support with publishing the paper. It's been a really interesting process in terms of like publishing my first paper. And yeah, getting out into the community, I'm really happy that's happening. And for the opportunity to speak today alongside a brilliant panel of speakers. So much overlap with what we're talking about, which is really exciting. Looking forward to having some chats outside of this as well. But yeah, I'm currently in the process of moving this weekend. So in fact today. So yeah, being part of this is a bit of a respite from the packing and cleaning. But yeah, so bear with me, but thank you. So as I come up to the first year mark of the PhD process, I find this an interesting moment to step back and reflect on this paper and the thinking which began during my Gender Studies Masters at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Since then, I have had opportunities to present and discuss my reflections at different forums, including at the 2022 Tamil Studies Symposium at York University in Canada, and a workshop at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London as part of programming during the run of Christian Philandron Thomas's exhibition, Another World. Okay. I share these engagement opportunities to decenter the initial written work from the master's thesis and incorporate that various forms of sharing and its reception in my paper. Okay, so the incorporation of community engagement and workshops connects to the current project which I'm developing, which has been mentioned by Harry Kaysen, doing my PhD, which is focused on exploring spaces of reflection and learning within the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora in the UK, a centre alternative spaces of knowledge production and knowledge sharing in grassroots community educational spaces. So, for example, Tamil schools and heritage initiatives like the Tamil Museum London project. And I will be thinking through the potential to expand the reach and engagement with the narratives and knowledge circulating in the spaces using, as Abana just discussed, critical pedagogic approaches. Yeah, I aim to kind of use those within my work as well. And the project will tie in critical reflection on my positionality as a PhD student, but also somebody who is engaged in community organising spaces and how I interact with the different forms of knowledge and power dynamics between these spaces. Yeah, looking at questions around how we as second generation educated in the diaspora engage with narratives we encounter in these community spaces that may contradict and or are absent in narratives and types of knowledge we engage with in mainstream educational spaces, including universities. So returning to the paper, which is in focus today, I'll start with a bit of context to the discussions. So in 2019, as part of my work with the Centre for Community Development, the sister charity of the Tamil Information Centre based in London, I spent some months in the homeland documenting the stories of women who'd been widowed in the conflict. I produced a documentary which captured the narratives of 5 conflict-affected women before, during, and post-conflict. And this was part of content displayed at the Tamils of Lanka Timeless Heritage Exhibition, which took place in May 2019. The exhibition marked a decade from the atrocities against the Tamil people at Mullawaikal. It showcased the history, heritage, and culture of Tamils on the island and was a space to learn, process, and acknowledge the struggles and resilience of the community. So taking on this theme of resilience, my documentary aimed to showcase narratives of resilience. And there's, on the slide, you can see a screenshot of the title of the documentary and a poster, a leaflet of the exhibition. I was part of the team organising the exhibition in the shadow of the loss of Mr. Vairamuthu Radhakumar, one of the founders and executive director of the Tamil Information Centre, whose vision the exhibition was. And I dedicated this paper to him for starting me out on the journey that led me towards producing this work. Dr. Rachel showing this paper in the first issue of the Tamil Academic Journal is a great resource in terms of that exhibition and the kind of narratives around that and experiences. So I just wanted to zoom into this. So I've mentioned that these are reflections from my master's thesis, plus some added kind of extras. But the paper summarizes interventions of my master's thesis, and the title of that master's thesis was Recasting Resilience, Decolonizing Narratives of Conflict-Affected Women in the North and East of Sri Lanka. However, the paper I've titled slightly different, and I think that's come with my relationships to the interventions after the thesis and kind of rethinking those. So instead of recasting resilience, I've used rethinking to mark a shift from attempting to reframe resilience towards a deeper questioning of the notion of resilience and its purpose, which I feel is more appropriately frames the work. Where in my thesis I claim the interventions to work to decolonize narratives, in my paper I use the phrase exploring decolonial possibilities to acknowledge decolonizing as a process as opposed to a finished outcome, highlighting how the intervention opens up ways of thinking and rethinking engagement with these narratives. So I'll just highlight some of the key interventions to hopefully entice you into reading the paper for further context. One of the central interventions of the paper is in considering agency. So a quote that a piece that I keep returning to throughout the work is Spivak's piece on titled "Can the Subaltern Speak?" So thinking about how brown women are represented in the literature, specifically South Asian. And I propose through my analysis that in the discourse, the subaltern can speak, but I query whether what she says can be heard. I highlight how in the discourse, the voices of conflict-affected women are absent or manipulated, using examples of human rights and NGO reports. I assert the way the narratives of these women are mobilized for broader political agendas, including the liberal peace agenda and neoliberal development. I connect these forms of representation to the constraining of South Asian women's agency and manipulation of their voices in colonial discourse. And I consider how these agendas systematically work to disempower these women in multiple ways. I also acknowledge how my documentary intervenes within this terrain, trying to challenge some of these dynamics and platform women's voices and ensure that they're heard within post-colonial discourse. Yet this work is also subject to some of those trappings that constrain women's agency. So yeah, just a kind of critical lens on my own work as well about how some of these agendas come into play as somebody based in the global north, interpreting and analysing these women's stories. So I trace alternative representations that could provide more expansive ways for framing these women's resilience and resistance. I use examples from Sangam literature and narratives of gendered spirituality to consider ways that women's resistance to oppression and or injustice is represented. So, for example, one of the narratives I draw from is from Sangha literature, the tale of Kannahi, seeking justice from the king for the murder of her wrongly accused unfaithful husband. In the paper, I acknowledge that whilst these narratives do have oppressive undertones in terms of holding women to a higher moral standard, there are revolutionary aspects that post-colonial feminist scholar Vijaya Ramaswamy and writer Meena Kandasamy attempt to reclaim in their works exploring Tamil women in mythology. In this paper, I also address questions around language, translation, and interpretation. I consider the responsibility of the diaspora in listening, recording, and advocating for the experiences of communities in the homeland. I recognise that our positioning in the global north requires us to ethically engage with these narratives and deeply consider what meaningful solidarity looks like. The intensification of violence against Palestinians over the past few months and the parallels with the plight of Tamils in 2009 has recently brought me back to the documentary in considering its potential value in terms of solidarities of struggles. A recent screening for colleagues at Warwick was followed by discussions of how the various struggles named by the women in the documentary resonated with many different contexts, including alignments with the various campaigns of families of the disappeared around the globe. My current work turns the lens further back onto myself and the diaspora to think about heritage and historical narratives that circulate within the space we create for the community. By focusing on spaces of reflection and processing, of how we relate to ourselves and community. I hope that this can enable further space for discussions around solidarity with those in the homeland and connect to other struggles across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's really interesting to hear the way that we look at these issues as academics and the role that academia has to play. And I think being critical of our own positionality is difficult. So thank you for sharing with that quite vulnerably, as well as your really interesting research and its links to different kinds of media. Great. So we move on to our next presenter. So we have Vinofa. Vinofa's paper is on the heritage language, education, and ethnic identity among second-generation Tamil immigrants in Canada, impacts, issues, and challenges. Vinofa is a recent graduate of Toronto Metropolitan University with a Masters of Arts in Immigration and Settlement Studies. While much of her research throughout her academic career has focused on issues relating to second-generation immigrants in the Tamil community, she's also worked on topics such as the relationship between geographic settlement, social capital, and immigrant political inclusion and the participation in the Toronto Tamil community, healthcare barriers faced by South Asian immigrant women, refugee mental health, and more. She's currently an integration program officer with Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, working together with nonprofit and community organizations that provide settlement services to newcomers. So Vinofa, we are excited to hear more about your work.
Thank you so much. 1 second, let me share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thank you everyone, and thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity. So as I said, I'll be speaking a little bit about my paper regarding the relationship between heritage language education and ethnic identity in second-generation Tamil immigrants in Canada. There we go. So before I begin, I just want to provide a little bit of background about myself and my inspirations and objectives in taking on this research. So as a second-generation immigrant myself, my interest in exploring second-gen experiences led me to complete my master's in immigration and settlement studies. And as a second-generation Sri Lankan Tamil immigrant, I was born and raised in Canada, and for my entire life so far, I lived in the community of Scarborough, which is widely known as the largest Tamil ethnic enclave in Canada, as well as one of the largest Tamil diaspora communities outside of Sri Lanka. As I entered my 20s, I began to think more deeply about what it means to be Tamil. And I often do participate in what is known as symbolic ethnicity, so things such as eating Tamil food, going to Tamil events, participating in different cultural events, stuff like that. I also played Carnatic violin for over 12 years, but despite all of this, I feel that I don't communicate as well with others in the community compared to my peers. I have very low literacy skills. I can't really read or write well in Tamil. I do completely understand, but I'm not, in my opinion, I'm not great at speaking as well. And I became very insecure about this as an adult. And this led to some internal conflict because the Tamil identity is named for the language. So how can one consider themselves to be Tamil when they don't have a firm grasp of the language? So this train of thought kind of led me to think about the reason that I'm not as proficient as I'd like to be. I've always been surrounded by Tamil in my household and in other aspects of my life. And when I was young, between the grades of 2 to 8, I also attended weekly Tamil classes in the evenings run by Toronto District School Board. And for me, I dreaded going to these classes. I found them boring. They weren't very engaging. Looking back, I don't really know if I've really learned anything from these classes, but I do have peers who attended classes in different schools or different institutions who did find that they benefited greatly. So thinking about this, I really want to explore the disparity and the quality and consistency of these classes. So this led me to my research. The purpose of the paper was to investigate the effect of heritage language classes on the identity building of second-generation Tamil immigrants, specifically in the Greater Toronto area. So the research questions that really guided this paper include, does an ethnic identity named for the language require skills in that language for membership? And does this connection to ethnic identity, can this connection be supported by language education? So some of the goals were to identify how language education classes can aid in language acquisition, to examine whether proficiency in the language or in Tamil can support second generation's connections to their identity, and to evaluate whether these classes did support a stronger sense of self-identity. So in doing so, I hope to identify gaps in language education, the gaps and limitations in the education, as well as provide some insight into the experiences of second generation Tamil immigrants, as well as provide or fill some gap in academic literature on language maintenance and language education in this community specifically. So my participants, the initial criteria for my participants were I was looking for people between the ages of 18 to 30 who are either born in Canada or arrived before the age of 7, who are currently living in the Greater Toronto Area in Canada and have attended some form of Tamil class at some point in their life. My selection criteria was initially very broad to try to cast a wide net of participants. However, the participants that I did have were all between the ages of 24 and 30. They were all born in Canada to one Sri Lankan parent, and they were all from the Toronto area specifically. So I did the diversity in the background and upbringings of my participants showcased that language maintenance is a very highly complex topic. So several factors of language maintenance with differing degrees of influences in the participants' fluency were identified. And the factors that were identified the most include home, family, and media. So almost all participants noted the importance and influence of family and upbringing to their fluency in Tamil. So for example, one participant noted that their spoken proficiency developed considerably as a result of living with their elderly grandparents. Outside of family, the other factor that was most identified was media. So TV shows, movies, music, and they're identified as a strong means of gaining knowledge on the language. So my study hypothesized that language plays a significant role in the identity building of second generation Tamil immigrants. And as such, participants were asked what ethnic identity means to them. So before mentioning language, many noted the importance and influence of family and community again, in terms of their ethnic identity negotiation. Some participants noted that they take inspiration from their parents' journeys and attribute their parents' lived experiences to their own identity. In addition to this, other things that were mentioned include culture, arts, community, religion, and geographic location. So in addition to their individual connection to their identity, many participants felt that both family and political and historical context of the diaspora as a whole were unique aspects to the collective Tamil identity. So all participants grew up around the time of some of the heaviest times of conflict, and that they felt that this backdrop had a profound impact on their identity. They acknowledged the challenges and impacts of the unrest in their own lives, such as intergenerational trauma, even though they all grew up in Canada and physically removed from any direct or physical impacts of the war. So some of the words that were mentioned a lot include resilience, sacrifice, and strength. So an underlying element to all of these was still language. All participants agreed that language is a crucial aspect of their identity, although for varying reasons. For example, many noted that language works in combination with all these other markers of identity, for example, history and art. So for example, some felt that their fluency in the language helped to strengthen their knowledge and understanding about culture, and in turn motivated them more to participate in these other forms of culture or art. And vice versa, participating in these other forms can also strengthen their proficiency in the language. So many scholars such as Shin, Lehman, Valentinov-Gradova, they've all noted the importance of language in identity negotiation. And this is also seen in the current study, as many participants have noted that they've had to learn and unlearn various notions about the Tamil identity and have come to embrace this identity more as they've gotten older and learned more about history and culture. So as for the selection criteria, all the participants have attended Tamil language classes, although for varying durations and at different institutions. So they all noted that the classes were very lecture heavy and minimally interactive and had a very heavy focus on reading and writing as opposed to speaking. They noted having to read long passages, which use a very old or formal tone of Tamil that's not very common in just day-to-day communication. And some participants also noted very little or no lessons on topics such as culture, holidays, background, stuff like that. All the participants did also note a very heavy lack of historical societal issues in the curriculum. So when asked about the level of enjoyment of their classes, some participants spoke more about the social aspect rather than the lessons or the classes. Other participants also voiced negative views. So some noted that the classes were very lax and the teachers weren't very supportive. They weren't very engaged in their learning. For two students in particular, they noted that the learning environment was particularly unfavorable. For these two participants, in particular, they had very irregular attendance. So one of them attended classes, they started at an older age, so they missed out on learning at the younger level, and the other one had a gap of 4 years where they didn't attend. So because of this, in combination of this and a lack of placement criteria, they felt that they were at a different proficiency level in comparison to the other people in their classes, which left them feeling that they were falling behind. So in both of these situations, they had difficulty engaging with the material, and they felt that they had a lack of support from the teachers to catch them up, which further led them to feeling discouraged. So many participants felt that the classes were insufficient in increasing their knowledge of the language. Most of them noted that they're still not confident in reading and writing despite the heavy emphasis of these skills in the classes. Many also noted that the very individual monotonous nature of the work didn't motivate them to learn at all. And this overall unmotivated and discouraged feeling was seen across the participants, and it's a very critical factor that inhibited their language development. So as noted by Cho, a low anxiety provoking environment and engaging materials required for a student to effectively learn and increase their competence in a second language. In some cases, high expectations from native speakers or family can often inhibit them or discourage heritage language learners. In this case, while it wasn't always necessarily the expectations of their family, but it could have also been the expectations of more proficient students or just being in that environment that discouraged them and created a feeling of being surrounded by those with different skills and just overall gave them a feeling of being unmotivated. So as expected, the participants' views on the impact of Tamil language classes on their identity varied greatly. So those participants who had a more positive experience with these classes strongly associate language as a crucial part of their identity negotiation, while those who did not have a positive experience felt that the classes either had no impact on their current lives or even a negative impact. So for these participants, they weren't able to grasp the language or engage with the material in the class, and they feel that they were able to gain a stronger grasp of the language through other means such as family or media. Some also noted that the just unpleasant experience with these classes and also the social experience in these classes led them to feel negative and actually hindered their desire to embrace their identity and provided them a setback in that sense. So the findings of the study show that although language is an established and critical marker of identity, Tamil language education did not really have a remarkable impact on the identity building of these second-generation immigrants. And this is seen as a result of several shortcomings of these language classes, such as a lack of engaging and relevant material, poor placement of students in different proficiency levels, and a lack of support from teachers. For some participants, the Tamil language classes were also a source of negative experiences, which hindered their desire to learn the language and embrace their identity. So therefore, to be genuinely beneficial, Tamil language classes need to be restructured to consider the more fluid identity and experiences of second-generation immigrants. All participants noted that substantial changes to the Tamil class curriculum and format can allow for greater benefits for students. And these changes include more engaging material, more content in history and culture, and sincerity of teachers. It was seen that the classes attended by participants did not consider the experiences of second-generation immigrants who exist in a state in between cultures. There is a generational shift in language transmission, and this is seen in Kanagaraja's study on language maintenance, specifically in Sri Lankan Tamil immigrants. The ways in which second-generation Tamil immigrants acquire the language is different, and the way they involve themselves with their identity has drastically changed throughout the years. So moving forward, Tamil education, language education, needs to reflect this change in students by focusing on material and content that will reflect their experiences, and fill in the gaps in knowledge to engage them in more meaningful ways that will allow them to deepen their connection to their identity. So the results of the study provides a number of future directions for both research and policy. It would be useful to validate the study with a larger and more diverse sample, and also look at other factors of language maintenance, such as socioeconomic factors, gender identification, migration status, and others, and how they can potentially affect second-generation Tamil immigrants and their identity negotiation. It would also be intriguing to examine other aspects of language acquisition in the community, including embodiment and dysphosia. And the study also showcases the importance of a consistent and uniform pedagogy and curriculum in relation to heritage language teaching. As each of the participants and their classes varied so greatly, there's no consistency really between all of their experiences. So this is an additional area of future research that can in turn be used to create positive changes in Tamil, or just in general heritage language education policy, to benefit Tamil students in the future. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening. This is a pretty high level overview, so I do hope you get a chance to read my paper in the future. And my thesis actually goes even more in depth, so if you are interested, feel free to reach out for that as well.
Thank you so much, Vinofa. Really interesting. And it's not often that you get to see heritage language education be critiqued in such a form. So it's quite an interesting topic for sure. So we're now going to move on to our final speaker, Ovia Sundar. So Ovia is an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, studying political science and economics. Her research interests in integration, multiculturalism, and caste are informed by her lived experiences growing up as an active member of the Tamil community. Her paper today will focus on caste and culture in Canadian multiculturalism, dismantling perceived homogeneity of Tamil identity. Ovia's research highlights how Canadian multiculturalism is failing to address the marginalization of certain caste identities within the homogenized Tamil minority, concluding that dismantling caste structures is essential to address this issue. Ovia, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen real quick. Can everyone see it? Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks again to Tamil Academic Journal for giving me this opportunity. There's been a lot of firsts for me through this process, and the support has really meant a lot. But without further ado, my paper and presentation is on caste and culture in Canadian multiculturalism and integration. So before we go on, just a brief or general overview as to what caste is. Caste is a system of social stratification dictating employment, livelihood, and a lot of other factors based on the hereditary community that you were born into. A lot of people think that caste is relegated to just South Asia, but with the influx of South Asian immigrants across the globe, caste has also been reproduced in various areas. And this graphic here kind of highlights that as you go down the caste hierarchy, that access and ownership of resources, land, and other opportunities decreases. This image is credited to Equality Labs, which is a nonprofit working to end caste discrimination in North America. So the caste reproduction isn't really acknowledged by a lot of the South Asian and Tamil community. Recently, there's been a push in legislation recognizing caste in North America in order to provide legal avenues for bringing justice to those affected by caste discrimination. The recency of this legislation is what in part interested me to look more into the reproduction of caste from a legal standpoint in North American legal frameworks. As a Tamil person and a member of the Tamil community, I've observed a lot of caste dynamics in social gatherings, but the lack of legal avenues in addressing serious issues of discrimination have become increasingly glaring. As a member of an immigrant family, I've had a lot of interest in studying integration, and the lack of avenues in addressing caste in North America while the caste system is still being reproduced led me to want to research what role integration has had in caste reproduction and discrimination. The term integration refers to the process by which refugees and immigrants are integrated into their host country, fostering identity that includes the one of their home country as well as the one of their host country. And multiculturalism, quote, focuses on the presence and recognition of multiple identities and efforts to promote diversity and inclusion, end quote, Song 2020. So there's little work done on caste as a facet identity involved in integration. Dr. Thange's Parmsoti study, Caste within the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, includes case studies exploring caste in local Tamil community gatherings, exploring the reproduction of caste in civil society, but doesn't delve as deeply into how multiculturalism contributed to this reproduction or the broader mode of identity that Tamil people subscribe to today. Dr. Anupriya Sriskandaraja, in her work Demonstrating Identities, Citizenship, Multiculturalism, and Canadian Tamil Identities, discusses multiculturalism and integration in constructing a Tamil identity through various interviews with Tamil youth, but these interviews don't include caste in the conversation of a Tamil identities construction. The rest of the literature review will be spread throughout this presentation, but many of the sources referenced in this paper and presentation fall along this trend as well, either addressing caste in the Tamil diaspora or addressing integration and Tamil identity in the diaspora, but rarely both. And then a note before we continue, this paper, rather than being novel, is an analysis of secondary data, interviews and studies that have been carried out thus far in this intersection of caste, integration, and Tamil community. This paper aims to explore the question of whether current policy is effective and provides conclusions based on the interviews and policies analyzed. The narrower scope of these conclusions should also be taken into account, as it's a call for this area to be explored more thoroughly rather than an established claim informed by novel research. I'll sort of be going section by section as to how the paper is currently divided. And section 1 is on Canadian multiculturalism. Canada has one of the highest populations of Tamil immigrants outside of South Asia, and multicultural integration is a large part influencing Tamil identity in Canada today. Canada employs the mosaic model of integration rather than the melting pot seen in the United States and various other European countries. The melting pot emphasizes the creation of a new identity or of the American identity, where the mosaic emphasizes diverse identities coexisting instead of immigrants being encouraged to forsake them in place of a collective national identity. Canadian immigration policy is heralded as a cornerstone of its multiculturalism, as well as its inclusivity. Section 2 talks about the formation of a singular Tamil identity. Multiculturalism has given many Tamil immigrants a sense of inclusion. Respondents in a Harvard study have made clear this affinity to Canada and its multiculturalism due to their improved treatment in comparison to their treatment in their homelands. Older generations are more likely to feel indebted to Canada and to their host countries. While this view may be entirely legitimate, it also means that older generations are less likely to criticize the way that they are being treated. They are seen as quote unquote good immigrants, ones who contribute to the country and its diversity, but don't overstep the lines the larger Canadian public and the multiculturalism have drawn. On the flip side, many Tamils have also been subject to negative stereotyping, such as being labeled a quote Tamil traitor or a quote fraud, more prevalent among the younger generations of Tamils. Tamils who pursue treatment and better recognition of their nuances in Tamil identity without adhering to the singular Tamil identity constructed by multiculturalism often face backlash because they take up more space than allotted to them by the narrow definitions of their identity. Religion, political beliefs, gender, sexuality, caste identity, etc., are all facets of Tamil life that go largely ignored by the multiculturalist mosaic, and thus are aspects of Tamil lives that are not recognized by the mainstream Canadian public. Food, culture, clothing are big parts of the singular Tamil identity that a lot of Canadians perceive Tamil people as today, and these are by no means the wrong things to highlight, but highlighting them alone portray the Tamil community as monolithic. Recognition of singular Tamil culture may foster community and unity in a country far away from home, but they also leave out those already marginalized in the homeland who continue to face marginalization in a system of integration supposedly designed to support them. The third section highlights caste in Tamil immigrant communities. Upper caste individuals not only had better access to jobs and education earlier on due to their migration status, but they were also the individuals who had the most say and were able to help define the narrower view of Tamilness subscribed to today. There is an increasing notion that, quote, articulating such an identity openly is viewed as rude and offensive and thus should not be openly discussed in the public, Haramzoli 2018, making caste-based discrimination much harder to address when coupled with the homogenization that Tamil people face due to the lack of discussion and visibility around caste. Caste cannot be explicitly addressed without breaking from the singular Tamil identity, as caste identity not only differs from the homogeneity of Tamilness, but it is a threat to it altogether due to its deep roots in the Tamil community. Section 4 talks about integration and homogeneity. Multiculturalism is a recognition of an identity agreed upon and designed by individuals most powerful in an ethnic group, and in this case, that happens to be upper caste Tamils. Multiculturalism allows the construction of identity and cannot allow individuals to fight caste oppression, since the negative stereotypes conflating individuals seeking change are responses showing a break in tolerance of the homogeneous Tamil identity by the public. Section 5 leads to discussions of change. There have been a lot of moves to end caste discrimination recently across North America, and a key example in this paper is the move by the Toronto District School Board, who passed a motion to ban caste discrimination in the district, which is a historic move towards the end of caste-based oppression in Canada as well as around the world. This move was met with a lot of backlash from the Canadian South Asian community, with many claiming that the move was Hindu-phobic. This claim was seen as legitimate by a lot of Canadians since it was painting a movement against oppression within the South Asian community as a movement against the homogeneous South Asian identity in general. And that's where this singular Tamil identity proves to be really fatal when addressing caste-based oppression. Simply expanding homogeneous identity to encompass more under an ethnic umbrella really co-opts one struggle into a larger identity without addressing the root of the issue. A major critique in the literature review so far on integration of policy, aiming to allow space for more nuanced identity, has been that laws fail to address homogeneity and representation and therefore fall short of achieving change for these groups. Current policies don't aim to challenge the source of the crises that caste oppressed individuals have faced, which is that they're under the shadow of a homogenized identity. So there's a series, these are the three main conclusions that I've sort of reached in my analysis of this data. Once again, the conclusions that I've reached are more narrow in their scope and are simply patterns that I've seen repeated and are suggestions in moves towards recognizing caste and caste discrimination. The first conclusion is that the policy formulated right now with the intent of maintaining homogeneous Tamil identity can't be used to effectively dismantle caste oppression. So moves that are sort of aiming to take apart that homogeneous Tamil identity and to shatter the tolerance and passivity pushed by multiculturalism should instead be supported. The second conclusion is the organization of the community and its integral part in allowing caste-oppressed immigrants to be a part of community that understands their hardships without diminishing them, rather than a part of community constructed by multiculturalism that instead alienates them. And moves taken by community members organizing around the recent legislation passed by the TDSB are such examples. The empowering of groups through community solidarity and local organizing are ways to challenge these structures effectively. And the third is to target workplaces, universities, schools, etc., instead of isolated surface level policy in order to guarantee a more comprehensive structural approach to combating caste oppression. Populist backlash that's resulting from the breaking intolerance of a homogeneous identity will no longer be a legitimate reason for the Canadian state to recognize dominant caste narratives, as caste oppression will now be rendered visible and then a lot harder to ignore. Visibility isn't possible within the confines of a singular Tamil identity, and prioritizing solidarity and community is a very important way to sort of help uplift caste oppressed Tamils and preserve their identities in the face of reduction. Thank you for listening, and once again, thanks for this opportunity. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Ovia. A very pertinent issue, and thank you for sharing that with us today. So hopefully now we will have an opportunity to ask all of our presenters some questions. Now, I know a number of you have been sending questions through already whilst the presenters have been speaking, and we will present those questions in a moment. But do feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat, and we will collect them and present them as you send them. Please feel free to directly send it to us as well, anyone with a tag in their name, just if you want to make sure that you are kept anonymous. We do encourage you, however, to raise your hand, and we also ask that people only speak once others have finished speaking as well, just so that we give everybody an opportunity to say what they need to say. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to say, do feel free to raise your hands, or I will start by some of the questions that you've been sending in already. Okay, excellent. So I have two questions from Ombihe for Niberna to start with. And the first one is, what are some examples of culturally informed ways of working that have been effective in addressing acculturation issues? Representation and training were examples given. Number two, can you explain what is meant by systemic ways of working in the context of acculturation gaps?
Really good questions. I think culturally informed ways of working, if I start with it, and it's a very British context as well, when my training's been here, it's very much naming race, ethnicity, sexuality, being really upfront. I think we might see that in, I don't know if it probably is around the globe. When you go somewhere, they're like, where are you from? If you go to a Tamakara, where are your parents from? I think there's something around building safety that happens by naming things. And so I think if I work with clients from intergenerational spaces, I usually say I'm Tamil, second generation. So the introduction and modeling that it's okay to talk about it. It's safe to talk about this. We don't have to pretend that we're not Tamil. We don't have to pretend there's an age gap. We don't have to pretend. I think also some of the making sure that the labor isn't placed on people, that knowing context is really important as well, that having historical context, whatever racial ethnic identity is, asking about it and then doing the labor of researching or thinking about, has there been trauma happened, and leaving the space open enough not to be assumptive as well, that they might not have gone through the things that we think we've gone through them. And I think more so also really creative ways of working is a really good way to work in a culturally informed way, that people get to self-define through creativity rather than naming it. I think also breaking out of traditional one-to-one models, going into more collective ways of working, which I guess leads into systemic ways of working, usually family therapy or couples therapy, which doesn't have to be romantic partners, but doing more than one person in the room. Here, family systems training, you train a separate route and you work with a family together, and then you have a reflective team that sort of, there's lots more people picking up a lot more different family dynamics, if you like. And so systemic ways of working includes that. I think also working with different organizations, that taking out the therapeutic space and saying, can I link you in with, I don't know, solicitors? Can I link you in with a special eating disorder service or disorder service, that you work more with systems rather than the individual? Do you know if that answers your question completely? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Niberna. So I'm just going to now kind of shift to Abarna now. And so we had a question that came in from Aaron, and his question was, what is the level of awareness on this subject among the community and non-community people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think with the emergence of the bill and a lot of the political representation we see from many different parties across so-called Canada, there's been more of a heightened awareness around what Tamil genocide means. And yet, especially in relationship to Shavina's presentation, there's been a lot of resistance to it, especially when we think about how Palestinian genocide education has been suppressed by school boards in Canada. This the reason our conflicts are extremely intertwined is because the material reality of what affects our students is extremely intertwined. So there is a level of awareness with so-called non-community members. I think in a Canadian context, and that's mostly what I'm speaking from, what we are seeing now are folks that actually did support in 2009, emerging with their own recollections and narratives and memories of what was happening during that time. So the knowledge is present. Among young people, I think it's important to keep cultivating it with the support of their peers. And yeah, I think that's my short and sweet answer to that.
So I think, so there's a bit of a follow-up for this. And
Yeah.
I guess, so this is a question coming in from Aarti now. And she asked, how much does memory activism and memory work factor, work factor into genocide education?
Yeah, so much. I can give you a little story for an explanation. Back in 2019, I started my first reading group with an organization, and in it we had a set syllabus. This week we'd be looking at, for example, Black July. And the next week we'll be looking at a specific set of events, and it would be a chronological historical examination of the struggle. There were a set list of texts that were assigned for each week, your traditional reading group, very much following Freire's banking system of education. And that was when I first learned that memory making, memory formation, and even like those gaping holes in memory were so present in our discussions, because in the group of students that joined for that session, instead of looking at the readings for that week, we spoke about where our parents were in '83. We spoke about like where they were physically located, where they migrated to after that. And it was a space to actively reconstruct some of these fragmented memories that parents were struggling to convey to students with knowledge that we had of what happened in '83. So for example, if there was something that my parent couldn't share with me, or my parents couldn't share with me, someone else was like, oh, I think I remember what happened in that region at that time because I read it here, or I understood it here. It was like this, almost like this puzzle that was emerging. I mean, at the time, I was a bit worried that we weren't getting to readings, but really this is a way of coming around to the readings and building together.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that. Now, Shavina, so we have a question again from Aarti, and her question is, what were some of the challenges you faced in making your documentary as a person from the global north, studying women of the global south? I'm thinking of what you mentioned of Spivaks, can the subaltern speak? Maybe, Aarti, you can give a bit more context.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you're talking about, agency, right? And studying women from Sri Lanka and being outside that. So, when Spivak talks about can the subaltern speak, she's talking about white men saving brown women from brown men. But here, I'm not saying that you're trying to save the brown woman, you're trying to save other brown women. I'm just thinking of those dynamics and tensions between the global south and the global north.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, that's a really important one. And yeah, I think what I'm trying to do in this work is to think about how in the global north, how we can be implicated in these power dynamics, especially in terms of the way the documentary and like certain like text is used to like frame the story, because yeah, with documentary making, there has to be a narrative, right, that pulls these stories together. So yeah, I kind of critically look at it from that lens, to understand how is it that we are still involved in some of those power dynamics, and what could it look like to try and explore other relations to these stories and narratives that can yeah, just try and reconfigure some of those power dynamics. So yeah, I think it's a complicated one that like we need to keep talking about in the diaspora. Yeah, especially when we do care so much, and there are various projects and things happening, and there's important work happening. Yeah, constantly like having that critical gaze, I think, is also important back on ourselves.
Thank you, Shavina. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to now move to Vinofa. And so this is a question from me. And I guess this is a broad question. And it's about, what do you think the future of the uptake of heritage language education will be amongst future generations in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area?
I feel like in my experience, my personal experiences, but as well, speaking to my participants and through the interviews, I do feel like unless there is a greater change, it's kind of going to go the same as it is now. So again, like in my interviews, but also just when I'm talking to people in my personal life, a lot of them have said that they'll continue to enroll their kids, even as second generation immigrants who were born here, they will continue to enroll their kids in classes because they want them to have that connection to their identity. But again, the experiences that we've had in our classes aren't that great. So I feel like there's not going to be much change unless we create that change, if that makes sense. Yeah, because even in my experiences now, or like to my knowledge, the classes are still the same as they were when I was a kid. I don't believe there's been much change in the curriculum over the past 10, 15 years. So I do think there needs to be more discussion on that and trying to kind of upgrade or evolve the way the classes are.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, I think this is a question that always crosses my mind, and yeah, I think this is a really great answer. So I'm now going to move to Ovia. Now we have a question coming in anonymously, and the question is, what are the ways in which you have seen, or do you see people from the Tamil community engage with the nuances of Hinduism and caste against the weaponization of religion used by people who want to maintain caste hegemony?
Yeah, so in my experiences as like a member of the Tamil community, a lot of the conversations I've had with other people around caste usually happen in temples or other religious spaces, and they usually come up along the lines of like how certain castes and caste identities interact with like temple spaces and like the different religious rites and services, because in a lot of Tamil temples, or at least in the Chicago area, they still follow a very I guess like an egalitarian approach as to where like caste isn't a big part of the conversation in religious practice, but like you can still sort of observe those like I guess rifts in identity when a lot of like South Asian people gather in one space. There's a lot of microaggression. There's a lot of like the roundabout way of trying to figure out like where people are from in order to sort of place their caste identity. And I think not only in terms of religion, but also in terms of like marriage and in the workplace, a lot of those sort of roundabout conversations come up. And I think the backlash that a lot of these caste movements are facing from primarily religious organizations is that people view caste discrimination or sort of anti-caste movements as being anti-Hindu because the two are so closely intertwined. And I think like sort of moving beyond viewing caste as just a religious problem, but also a cultural problem and a like sociolinguistic problem would be a more comprehensive approach to sort of addressing how deep-rooted it is in our community, especially since it's not just relegated to like religious spaces, but a lot of different aspects of our lives. I hope that answered that question.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions? So we have about 3 more minutes. Okay, so Raj Kumar just dropped in a message right now saying there was a conference in Canada on Tamil teaching. Over 200 Tamil teachers attended. Good to check out their website or new suggestions. Okay, thank you, Raj Kumar. Okay, and so there is a question from Minoya, which is, and this is a question for everyone, so all the panelists here. So I think this is best. How can we explore trauma-informed approach and practice in the Tamil context? Trauma-informed has often been approached through a Eurocentric lens. is there an appropriate and or specific framework that allows room for cultural sensitive practice within a trauma-informed approach that has been useful in your work, or has labor mainly fallen on you as a practitioner, researcher, facilitator to navigate? Hope that makes sense. Any initial thoughts from anyone? Bearing in mind we only have about a minute or two left.
I can do a quick one. I think one thing I would take from Eurocentric practice is stabilization. I think people often forget our physiological responses to trauma and going into sort of freeze, fight, flight zone. So that stabilization work, I think, is really important to let know people what's about to come once they start processing. And I think just more cultural practices with food and joy. I think we need to start thinking about trauma-informed is also bringing in joy and legacy work as well as processing is what I would quickly add to that.
Any other thoughts? Thank you. Final thoughts.
I think also just to add to Nirbana, I think, yeah, it's also just about us reflecting on this and building on this. Like, and I think it's really important to pose this question out in a space like this, because I think we're constantly learning. And yeah, as Nirbana mentioned, I'm also part of ANBA UK, and that's a constant conversation within the work that we do. But I think, yeah, just being intentional about the way that we're holding space, and being mindful that of what dynamics are coming up and the lived experiences when you are kind of having these conversations. And so trying to incorporate things within kind of workshops or things that you're running to ensure the safety of people. And yeah, because it's important we talk about difficult topics, and we do, but yeah, there's always ways to kind of make it a bit more better for everyone involved.
Thank you, Shabina. Thank you. So I think we're going to have to wrap up the questions at this point, because we're nearing the end of our 2-hour session today, and we're just going to have a couple of points regarding kind of tomorrow and next steps, and a little bit more about the Tamil Academic Journal just before we finish this session. So if we could get back to the slides, please. Thank you. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So tomorrow between 10 and 12 p.m, we'll be hopefully having a roundtable around our upcoming thematic call for papers. So 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. UK time, we'll be having this roundtable. And this will be around the theme of arts, media, and the politics of representation. So through this conference, we hope to open up the conversations around how art and media have shaped Tamil identities by aiding narratives of collective community, participating in social and political movements, and inventing and challenging appropriate art forms. We hope to offer fresh insights into how art and media have been embraced, used, and innovated differently. We also aim to look at the equal possibility of the reverse, art and media interrogating societal and political practices. Now, joining us for the conversation tomorrow will be Dr. S. Raghuram, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Professor of Media Studies at the University of Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka. Alongside him will be joining Abhi Chinnaiya, who is a self-taught portrait photographer and writer based in New Zealand. And finally, but not least, we have Thusiyan Nandakumar joining as well on this roundtable, and he's the editor-in-chief at the Tamil Guardian, and a medical doctor based in the UK. So just final few comments. So if we could move to the next slide. Yes, just before the final slide about our upcoming call for papers. Excellent. So we are pleased to announce that this will be our new upcoming call for papers, so art, media, and the politics of representation for the coming year. And we look forward to your submissions to this. We will also be continuing to roll out the non-thematic papers edition as well. So please feel free to also submit papers on other themes and topics as well. So the email to go to is tamilacademicjournal@gmail.com. So in terms of our next steps and our vision as a journal, We are a growing journal and we're constantly reflecting on our practices, and we hope to embed initiatives that challenge the unequal structures in academia. And in the upcoming year, we're looking to fundraise for our strategies to work more on more equitably with Tamil communities and academics. So three core things that we'll be working on in the coming year is working towards institutional affiliation to apply for grants. The grants will hopefully help us compensate peer reviewers and speakers in future as well. And we want to center voices and academics from the global south as well. So finally, we would really appreciate if you could support our fundraising for the Tamil Academic Journal. So do feel free to scan this QR code here and to donate. But you can also support us in other ways, for example, by joining our team, submitting papers and helping with the wider work. So do email us at tamilacademicjournal@gmail.com. And we'd appreciate any support that you can provide, or even any ideas that you have in terms of how we should steer this journal moving forward. At the end of the day, this journal is for you and for the community, and we want your voice to shape how this journal caters for the wider community. Okay, so thank you everyone, and Nandri Vanakkam everyone, and we hope to see you tomorrow, and we want you to join in this roundtable discussion, and we want your voices to shape the outcomes of that decision. So thank you, Nandri Vanakkam, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.